Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome once again to the Barts 900 series. A very warm welcome to everyone, wherever you are in the world. We've got a couple of hundred viewers tonight, and once again, it's an international audience with quite an increase in numbers, particularly from the League of Nurses. So welcome to you all. I'll introduce our guest speaker in just a moment, but first I want to share with you the big news that His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales has kindly agreed to take the patronage of Barts Heritage for the period leading up to and including the 900th anniversary of the foundation of Barts in 1123. So this is extremely good news, and we're very welcome to have that patronage. And no doubt we'll be bringing you more news of that as the months and the years unfold leading up to that important anniversary. Well, we can now switch to our guest speaker tonight. He's going to be talking about James Gibbs, one of the key people in the history of Barts. As you all know, the architect who rebuilt the hospital in the early part of the 18th century. So a very warm welcome to our guest speaker, William Aslet. William, good evening.
Good evening.
Very good to have you here. Now, I know we sent out a little bit of detail about your history, so tell us a little bit more about that, because I think you're a graduate of both Oxford and Cambridge. Tell us a little bit about your academic career and how it led you to this particular interest in James Gibbs.
Gosh, right. I think my interest in Gibbs really began before my academic career, because I also I grew up in London, and as with Oxford and Cambridge, London is home, one of the most famous buildings and one of the most famous squares in the world, really. St Martin the Fields is by Gibbs, and I think it was looking at St Martin the Fields that really sort of planted the Gibbs seed in my head. And then when I was at Oxford, I read history. I was occasionally in attendance at the Radcliffe Library, which is one of, I talk about it in my presentation, it's really Gibbs' masterpiece. And when I was there, I thought, well, I wanted to write something about architectural history for my dissertation. And I realized that Gibbs is an architect who is incredibly important. He designed a whole host of famous and significant buildings, but who, in an academic sense, is understudied, and about whom more, I hope, remains to be said. I hope I'll be I have found interesting things to say for my PhD project, which I'm now doing at Cambridge, home to another couple of great Gibbs buildings.
Well, that's really good to hear, because of course we're aware that Gibbs had a massively important career even before he arrived at Barts. So begin at the beginning and tell us a little bit more about the man, his training and his early career, if you will.
Well, perhaps I could show you my PowerPoint presentation, which will allow me to elaborate with visual illustration.
Please do.
Gibbs was born in Aberdeen. His whole career was in London. He worked in London as an architect, but he grew up in Aberdeen. And these two illustrations they're both from the 19th century, and they both give a sense of what Aberdeen must have been like. It was a prosperous mercantile town, but it's still, even in the 19th century, over 100 years after Gibbs' birth. Gibbs was born in 1682. Looked very medieval in aspect. And on the left is the old town, and on the right is the Marischal College, now incorporated in the University of Aberdeen, where Gibbs studied briefly. But one of the things that singles him out in the British architectural history of his time is the fact that, or history of British architecture in general, is the fact that he was the first British-born architect to have trained under an Italian master in Rome. And as a young man, he left Aberdeen and he went to Europe, and he went to Rome, and he arrived there in 1703, initially because he wanted to train to be a Catholic priest. And I've got a slide showing you what Rome would have looked like in those days, just to give you a sense of the Piazza Navona, which many of your audience, I'm sure, will know, having been to Rome, but just to give a sense of the contrast there would have been from between Gibbs' roots in Aberdeen and this amazing international cosmopolitan city with superb classical style architecture that he would have been confronted with. But as I was saying, Gibbs didn't initially go to study architecture in Rome. He actually initially went to train as a Catholic priest, and he enlisted at the Scots College in Rome, which is where young Scots trained for the Catholic priesthood. But after a year, he found the climate so hostile and unpleasant. It was run by a real bully of a rector that he decided to give it all up. And he got himself recommended to no less a figure than the Pope's architect, Carlo Fontana, who was the successor to Gian Lorenzo Bernini as the preeminent architect working in Rome. And Gibbs studied under Fontana for 3 or 4 years until he had to come back. He had to move to London because his brother had fallen ill. And in fact, he died by the time he got back to London. But for the fact that Gibbs was trained under Fontana really places him as an architect in a really international context, which is again one of the most significant things about him. It's the fact that he was one of many people who were trained by Fontana, many of whom were the leading court architects all over Europe, and many of the most important architects working in Europe of this day had some connection with Fontana's studio. So that's the prehistory, as it were.
Do you know anything about? I mean, it must have been a massive wrench for him going from. I know Aberdeen is pushing to be the European city of culture in a few years' time.
Yes.
But nevertheless, the view that you've just shown us of the Piazza Navona, it must have been a chalk and cheese moment for young Gibbs, surely.
I'm sure it was, and I think the fact that really says the most is that he never went back to Aberdeen after he returned to Britain. So clearly he got the architecture bug in Rome, and he wanted to work in a sort of city of international importance. And London, when he arrived there, would have been an incredibly exciting city for a young architect, because his was the London. He arrived in late 1707, early 1708, and this was the city, the post-fire city that had been so altered by Sir Christopher Wren. And there was through Wren and Hawksmoor, Nicholas Hawksmoor, one of Wren's greatest pupils, London had changed a great deal, and there was a lot of very exciting new classical style architecture, which not least St Paul's Cathedral, which was only just finished in the year that Gibbs came to London. So he would have seen this this really lively and architecturally interested city, which he would have seen as a great place to make his career. But so moving to London, he had a few years in which he struggles to establish himself, but eventually, through the patronage of John Erskine, Earl of Mar, he was able to get himself recommended to the surveyorship of the Commission for 50 New Churches, which, again, I was talking about, London as a chance of exciting architectural opportunity, and this is one major instance of this. This was a project that was started by the Tory government in the last years of Queen Anne's reign to build 50 new churches after the 50 or so that were rebuilt in the City of London. Ultimately, only about, I think, a dozen were finished, but the ambition was to have, beautiful, magnificent, solidly built churches, and Gibbs, as surveyor, got the opportunity to design one of these. So in the left is a mezzotint of after a now lost painting, which shows the young Gibbs holding the plan of this church on the right in it, which is St Mary le Strand, which many of your viewers, I'm sure, might know, because it is today, as it then was, in one of the most prominent sites in London. It's right in the heart of the Strand, which was the road that connected the City of London to the Palace of St James's, which is where Queen Anne was resident, and also the Palace of Westminster, where Parliament was resident. And it was an enormously important position, and so a really exciting opportunity for Gibbs, because this was his first public commission, and he came up with this really innovative and unique design, which borrows in the West End, the front end with the portico, quite liberally from the north and south of Rennes St Paul's Cathedral, but also in the side elevations has a sort of a lively character entirely of Gibbs' own, which surely shows some kind of debt to his years in Italy. And on, actually, I might just point out, on the dome of the porch, there's a little statue which was to be of Queen Anne, which was never executed. That was going to be, it was cast in Florence, but it was never actually brought to England. And from St Mary le Strand, Gibbs really established himself as one of the leading architects in London, and a whole host of commissions came his way, which led to his next major church commission, which was the Church of St Martin in the Fields, which I referred to just briefly earlier. But Gibbs won this commission, which was really the most important church commission of his day, against competition from several other architects, but he was chosen, and he created for St Martin's this really novel formula for the design of a church, which proved to be extraordinarily influential. So in the late 17th century, early 18th century, architects in Britain were basically looking for a way of designing an Anglican church that took Anglican, the requirements of Anglican liturgy, but were also in a classical style. What Gibbs did here that proved so influential was he combined the form of a classical temple. So at the front, you can see there are 6 columns with supporting a pediment, the triangular part. And he combined that with a spire, which is rising from its roof. And Sir Christopher Wren had done a lot to create classical models of Gothic spires, but essentially the spire is Gothic, and he's slammed that onto the roof of the temple. And it was a sort of bold, but a solution that became incredibly influential thanks to its boldness and its simplicity, and that spread all over the world, where British people, English speakers, were in the process of colonizing, thanks to this book that he published, which was a book of architecture. Here is the plate showing St Martin in the Fields. It was the first book by a British architect to consist entirely of his own designs. And it means that all over the world, even today, it's a great range of churches which look like St Martin in the Fields. So on the left is a 19th century church, which is St Andrews in Kolkata in India. In the middle is St Paul's Chapel, right in the heart of the financial district in Manhattan, New York. And on the left is the Congregational Church in New Haven, Connecticut. And you can see that all of these are using the Gibbsian solution of temple front with spire on top of it. I could give you many other examples of this. But Gibbs didn't just work as a church architect, of course. He also worked extensively as an architect for the universities, what were then the only two universities in England. And this is the Senate House that he designed for the University of Cambridge, which remains today at the heart of Cambridge University, as it's where students go to graduate, and it is one of the defining features of King's Parade, which is the touristic heart of Cambridge, which obviously I know very well, studying there. Senate House actually wasn't is only a third of what was projected to be a court of three sides. So the Senate House, as it is the building on the right in this slide, and it was actually going to be one side of three. So on the other side, there was going to be a building for university offices and admissions, and in the middle was going to be a great big library designed to host the King George I's bequest of books at the university. But thanks to wrangling with fellows and so on, it wasn't built. But again, you can see Gibbs, the classicist here, with these temple fronts and pediments, and Cambridge would look very different if this had been built. And in Cambridge, he also designed the King's College Fellows Building, which is really one of the most iconic buildings in Cambridge. This is a rather snazzier shot, not taken by myself, but showing the tourist view of the backs. And I'd like to point out that in a recent poll of most beautiful views in top 20 most beautiful views in England, this is one with the Gibbs building, and Oxford with the Radcliffe camera is another. So two of them at top 20 most beautiful views in England have buildings by Gibbs at their heart. And this was for the accommodation of fellows, and it was also part of a larger project. Apologies for the slightly low-res quality of this slide, but you can see here that the Gibbs building, as built, is at the back of this engraving, and there was going to be a twin on what's now this Gothic style screen by William Wilkins on King's Parade, and perpendicular to these two, there would have been a hall with a huge temple portico on the front of it. But sadly, the college had put an awful lot of money into the South Sea bubble, which all went. Which it then lost a considerable amount of. So only the Fellows Building was built, and this here, still on the theme of universities, is I think his crowning achievement, which is the Radcliffe Library in Oxford. As at King's College, actually, this was a commission on which Gibbs replaced Nicholas Hawksmoor, that maverick pupil of Sir Christopher Wren I alluded to earlier. But Hawksmoor having died, Gibbs took over the idea of a round library, but he stepped it into the centre of Radcliffe Square and gave it again a sort of liveliness and an ornamental quality that really are very, very characteristic of the architect. And here you see his essential, what he's essentially done is he's taken a Roman palazzo, which he would have known well from his days in Italy, and he's wrapped it round the drum of this dome. But Gibbs wasn't just an architect for universities, he was also an architect of country houses. This is Ditchley House in Oxfordshire, which was for the second Earl of Lichfield, and it shows Gibbs working in a sort of more restrained and elegant mode. And he was really, really one of the foremost architects of this kind of building in England of this date. And your viewers might see parallels between this and St. Bart's Hospital, which is similarly very economical in the expression of means on the exterior, but I haven't got a shot of the interior here, sadly, but it is also more exuberant on the inside than on the out. But he could also, sorry.
I was going to say, talking about our viewers, William, can I just bring in a comment we've had from Patricia Schaffenberg? She's over in the USA, and it refers back to the remarks you were making about the international spread of Gibbs' influence a few minutes ago. And she says she actually works in a building that is greatly influenced by Gibbs. So I think it reflects that breadth of influence that you were talking about earlier. But no, it's interesting to have that comment from her, and it's prompted me to remind you of something that I should have told all our viewers at the start of the program. That if you do want to ask William a question, do make use of the Q&A button down at the bottom of your screen, and we'll either absorb those questions during the program or mop them all up at a Q&A session at the end. Sorry, William, do carry on.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, do send any questions. I'll do my best to answer them. But finally, he wasn't just an architect of the country houses themselves, but he also designed many ornamental buildings in their gardens, which were very popular at this date. And I wanted to show just a final example of Gibbs when he wasn't working at St. Bart's, which is the Gothic Temple at Stowe House in Buckinghamshire. And this shows that Gibbs, although he predominantly worked in a classical mode, he could also work using a Gothic language, as in the language of the medieval built heritage of Britain. And this is actually quite an early essay in the Gothic, which had yet to really take off as a fashion in the way that it did later in the 18th century. And it's a really original and quirky essay that shows just what a versatile architect Gibbs could be, and that's why I think he was so attractive to it's so attractive and successful an architect to commission, because he could adapt what he was doing really to suit the needs of the patrons, which brings me to his work at St. Bart's Hospital. This is this was used to illustrate the talk, but this is a portrait by Andrea Soldi of Gibbs in old age. We've seen him in young age, and here he is in old age with the Radcliffe Library behind him. But St. Bart's Hospital was a project that really occupied Gibbs for much of his career, or that he was at least in some way involved in. He was appointed as a governor of the hospital in 1723, April 1723, which was just around the time that he was that Sir Martin the Fields was going up, and the building.
Do you think that was a particularly savvy move by his fellow governors there, William? Because obviously they've got this promising architect right on their doorstep. They know that the hospital is going to have to get the builders in sooner rather than later. So having a notable architect as one of their number must surely be a pretty good move.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, I think that was something they very much had in mind, and I believe this is how it worked in the 18th century, that you would appoint people that you wanted to be generous to your charitable institution, to be governors and hoped that they would give generously. Many of them did. Gibbs wasn't, in fact, actually the only architect who was made a governor of St. Barts. They also had Richard Boyle, the third Earl of Burlington, who was an amateur architect. Well, he wasn't an amateur, he was a practicing architect, but also an influential tastemaker, and George Dance the Elder. And Gibbs was appointed to be an architect at St. Barts at around the time they were definitely thinking of rebuilding. So he was part of a committee that was formed, including the architect Nicholas Hawksmoor, about whom we've already heard a bit, and the master mason John Townsend, to think about possibilities for building a new hospital, because by this date, St. Barts, which, as we know, is an incredibly old institution, only 900 years old this coming year, or some say even older, was a bit of a jumble of different buildings that had accrued over time, and with other buildings, other hospitals being built in London at this date, and also a general thought of sanitary precautions that needed to be taken. The governors of Barts were thinking about a new building, but it wasn't actually for 5 years that that construction or started, or that Gibbs submitted his designs. And the first his first possible involvement, says Terry Friedman, the previous historian of Gibbs, was for this this anatomical theatre which he designed for Dr. John Friend, who was connected to the hospital. And you can see here the sort of tiered seating and a space in the middle for dissections and things to occur. But in 1728, Gibbs submitted his designs to the hospital, and the decision was taken that the hospital was going to be rebuilt conformable to one design. And on the 12th of September, he submitted his proposals and an estimate of £8,500 for the first building, which doesn't sound much today, which was a handsome sum in those days, which was accepted. And his design was for this quadrangle, which you see here in an early illustration or an engraving by Robert Ware. It was for a quadrangle of 200 by 160 feet, which has as its distinctive feature. Yes, here's another engraving by Benjamin Cole showing the elevations of the administrative block, which was the first block to be built, and
that is the north wing, I think.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And the courtyard in plan. But one of the important things about Gibbs' design was that the hospital was to be, the wings were to be separate. And this was very important, as Gibbs explained, because it meant that there was a lesser chance of fire spreading. There was a fire, it meant that it wouldn't spread to the other buildings. People were very concerned in these years with the risk of fire. It wasn't the Great Fire of London was still in relatively recent memory. And it also was good for sanitary reasons, which was another concern. This illustration shows it shows St. Thomas's nearby in Southwark, it then was, which was rebuilt pretty much in 1693 to 1720, so it was finished just before a decision was taken to rebuild St. Barts, and it may indeed have been the catalyst for the rebuilding. And it shows a more conventional hospital design with connected, the wings are connected, and there are separate courts but everything is connected.
To bring you up there, William, we've had one or two of our viewers point out the fact that the name of the hospital is Barts, and that St. Barts is an island in the West Indies. Don't worry, this is this is an ongoing discussion that we've been having recently, and I know there's actually been a letter written to the Telegraph this very week on the matter, because various other people make exactly the same mistake as you do. But don't let it bother you.
No, sure. Yeah. If I wish I were delivering this presentation from St. Barts in the West Indies, but sadly, travel restrictions.
Good point.
But yeah, so and there's a scholar, Anne-Marie Akehurst, who works on the hospitals in this period, who suggests that Gibbs might also, or probably would have been, aware of hospital designs in Europe, because this was, again, it was a concern that people were having, which was, how do you keep disease from spreading in a hospital, as well as fire. But so to go back to the drawings, Gibbs' scheme was for one block, which is at the bottom in the plan of this engraving, which was to be an administrative block, which was to have housed the Great Hall, which is there today, and also offices for the hospital. And then the other three blocks were to have been wards. And again, Gibbs was innovating here, because instead of long, drafty corridors of dormitories, which was, I believe, how St. Thomas's was organised at Barts, the wards, the wings were going to be divided into wards, which of which there would be 4 in each floor. Each would have accommodated 14 people, with a separate nurses' room at the end, and which meant that the wards could house a total of 504 patients, which I'm sure is considerably expanded today. This is the heart of the hospital. But anyway, the first building to be built was the administrative block, the Great Hall. And it might seem slightly strange to start rebuilding a hospital by building the ceremonial heart, but it's ceremonial hearts. But the reason for this was that, like today, it provided a great opportunity for fundraising. Having a Great Hall meant that you could provide a meeting space for governors, but also you could invite people who might want to be benefactors to the hospital to dine there in banquets. So it did make sense, because at Barts, as in many other projects of this period, it was quite difficult to raise the money. I mean, we've already discussed two projects by Gibbs which weren't finished, at least in part because the money wasn't forthcoming. And so this made sense. If you wanted the rest of the project to happen, you built the most impressive bit first. And construction, engravings engravings were issued in 1729, and that was another thing you'd do in this period. You'd make engravings of the project, not unlike the ones that I've just shown you here, to show potential benefactors what it's going to look like, and excite them by with a new design. But construction didn't actually begin until 1730, because the governors an approach was made to the governors by an enterprising an entrepreneur from Bath called Rafe Allen, who was trying to get this new building material of Bath stone introduced into London. And he tried to do this at Greenwich in 1728, but he'd been unsuccessful. So he tried to push it to St. Barts. And Gibbs' original proposal for the hospital had been that it would be built of brick with facings in Portland stone, which is actually the white stone with which it's faced today. And it's the building stone that's used all over London. But Rafe Allen basically offered them a good deal on this stone, which had to be shipped from Bristol. So construction wasn't actually begun until 1730, and it was finished in 1732. And as I've already mentioned, the crowning feature of this block. Oh, sorry, I didn't explain that this is Gibbs' drawing for the hall, which again, apologies for the not excellent quality of this slide, but this is a drawing which is kept in his collections, which are now at the Ashmolean Museum, Oxford, and which he left to the Radcliffe Library when he died. And you can see that the ceiling design for the Great Hall has actually altered slightly, but otherwise it's essentially as it is today, with the Hogarth's stair on the left-hand side. And this is the Great Hall, which on which a great amount of very impressive craftsmanship was deployed. The ceiling span itself is an impressive, it's 35 feet, and it was which was technically quite difficult to achieve. There's a very high quality of carpentry supporting it. The master mason on the project was a man named Robert Taylor, who was the father of Sir Robert Taylor, who later became quite an important architect. And the ceiling was executed by a little known Italian plasterer called John Baptist San Michele, whom Gibbs employed in favour of his usual stuccator team of Attari and Baguti, Giovanni Attari and Giuseppe Baguti, who were from Ticino in Switzerland, which is now Switzerland, which is where a lot of these plasterers came from. And this was also an Italian craftsman. But I've got a video here taken one of your drone shots to show. Oh, sorry. Before that, I have Gibbs' drawing for the ceiling. So this is again at Oxford, and it shows that even though San Michele executed the plasterwork, he was doing so to Gibbs' designs. Gibbs designed quite a lot of the detail of his buildings too, not just the main parts. He had quite a high level of control, and I guess this was one of the other appeals as an architect. He could do the whole package. He didn't, and he could bring in a team of people that he knew could do it. So this is a video just to give you a sense of the quality of the plasterwork, just taken by our host this evening, Robert.
Actually, your point there, it helps answer a question that we've had in from Janet Walker, who asked, did Gibbs actually design the interiors of his buildings? So you've remarked upon the fact that he was responsible for some of the interior here in the Great Hall.
Yeah.
Okay, perhaps not the craftsmanship, but certainly the design. What about the Radcliffe Library, for instance? Was he responsible for the interior there?
Yes, yeah, he was.
Right.
And he would work, the Radcliffe plasterwork is by Attari of this team. They were the team used at St Martin in the Fields as well. And they could really, they could do a lot more than what Gibbs, they were, sorry, by that I mean, they were creative artists in their own right, and they were very skilled craftspeople. But when Gibbs was employing them, he would more often than not make the drawings from which they work, to rein them in a bit. So he liked to design, I mean, things like the ceiling of St. Barts, which is quite a sort of tightly ordered architectural design, in which they've added a lot of, in which San Michele has added a lot of flourishes in the plasterwork, but he liked to have quite close control over what they did. So yes, I mean, even at the Radcliffe Camera, well, sorry, today it's the Radcliffe Camera, then it was the Radcliffe Library. Even that is, many of the details are designed by him. So the railings were designed by him, even the gates on the outside, which is today, the bottom floor has been converted into a reading room, but then it was open. But he designed these gates to keep out mischievous people, and even the ironwork was to his design. So yes, he designed most of the buildings that he built, even though he wasn't.
So hospital security was an issue even 300 years ago then.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that was at the Radcliffe, but no, it's certainly at St. Barts too. Barts too. Correct myself. Thinking of holidays now. But yes, even though he wouldn't always supervise a project in person, because if he was working on a country house, he might not be able to make site visits very regularly. So he would give craftspeople a degree of autonomy, but they would be working broadly to his designs. And at Barts, he would have been able to supervise very closely, because he was being based in London and everything. And this brings me to the other great highlight of the administrative wing, which is Hogarth's paintings. Hogarth was made a governor in 1734. He got the project by offering to do it for free, which is what Gibbs also did. He didn't charge for his services as an architect, which was another, going back to your early point of how canny a move it was for the governors to have appointed him one of their member. He, like Hogarth, worked for free, and it meant that Hogarth could get the commission over a rival Italian, Giacomo Amiconi. So after the hall was finished, and the hall was the ceiling was made in 1733 to 4, and the hall was beginning to be furnished in 1732. Hogarth did these paintings. The earliest is the one I'm showing on the right here, which is the Pool of Bethesda, which is the one shown in this photograph. And then on the left was the Good Samaritan, and in ornamental surrounds painted by other artists, which also have a very Gibbsian quality. But Hogarth, actually, if I might digress, had sorry, you're muted. You're on mute.
I was going to say I wouldn't digress too much, because we're going to be getting a specialist speaker on Hogarth early next year.
I see.
Time is moving on.
Well, okay. In which case, I will only mention that Gibbs and Hogarth had a long-lasting connection as a result of this. So this is the portrait of Gibbs that Hogarth drew and was engraved by Bernard Barron for as the frontispiece of his book, showing the designs of the Radcliffe Library. And this is a later engraving by Hogarth, which is a second plate of the Times, and it shows the Church of St Mary le Strand in the background by Gibbs, and it's being sort of, it was executed in the 1760s, so after Gibbs had died, and it's being crowded out by all of the modern buildings going up around it. So it's an example of good taste being crowded out by the bad, essentially. And I conclude by just describing how the other buildings in the hospital were erected, because, as I said, this was a long project that occupied Gibbs for much of his life, and the other wings of the hospital didn't go up without hitch. So the south block, which now no longer exists, it was demolished in the early 20th century to be replaced with the George V building, which was completed in 1937, was begun in 1735, so just before Hogarth was painting the pool at Bethesda. And it was begun because they had an anonymous request of £2,000 to get the ball rolling. But and it's the same height, but is slightly more scaled back because with this, the centerpiece is blind because there was quite a narrow corridor linking the wards, and the foremost concern was with the provision for patients. And I believe it was the South Block was the block that was intended for poor patients. And again, it was a charitable institution, greatly concerned with providing for those the needy in society. The West Block wasn't begun until 1743, so there was another break, and the construction of this actually was considerably delayed by the outbreak of the 7 Years' War, which meant that it was very difficult to get the stone shipped from Bristol up to London, this Bath stone that they were using. So the construction paused in 1745 and was only resumed in 1748, by which time Gibbs was getting on quite a bit. He was becoming an old man. 1749, the governors couldn't get a hold of him because he'd gone to Spa in Aix, and that was finished in 1753, the year before he died. Yeah, Gibbs had kidney stones, I should say, and he was also a bit of a bon vivant. So he no doubt had problems exacerbated by a lifetime's consumption of good food and drink.
I know nothing about renal medicine, as many of my colleagues will attest, but I'm not sure of the connection between diet and kidney.
No, I'm sure. I was saying that I'm sure he had that as well. In addition, he's attested as having been quite fond of his food and drink. No, I wasn't suggesting a link between the two. And
he had a fairly lonely family life, didn't he? Because he never married, but he was living in Wimpole Street, curiously, but that was before it became one of the central streets of the medical establishment.
Yes, yeah, exactly, and that was part of the Harley estate, which was a speculation by Edward Harley, who became second Earl of Oxford. He was the son of Robert Harley, who many consider Britain's first prime minister, even though that normally goes to Robert Walpole. And yeah, that was a project for the development of London. So that's why he was in that part of the city. But he then eventually moved to Henrietta Street, which was, I think, also part of the Harley estate, in a house that he designed. He designed quite a lot for Harley in his speculation. But yeah, so after when Gibbs died, he left £100 to the hospital to show that he was keeping it in his mind. He'd actually, by this point, his health was so bad that he'd had to step down as a governor, but he still left this £100 to the hospital. But he died with his project for a four-sided quadrangle unfinished. And it was only the construction of the final block was only begun in 1758, which was 4 years after he died. And that was executed under supervision of, I think, Sir Thomas with Robinson, and that took 10 years. And the reason the completion of this final block took so long, so was another delay, was caused by the fact that the treasurer of the project, John Toff, absconded with £4,000, which considerably interfered with the construction of the final wing. So yeah, not executed by Gibbs, but to his design. And yeah, I hope that's provided a good overview of Gibbs' career, and also
It certainly has, William. If you could turn off your screen share, and we can just take a couple of questions before we close. Thank you very much. Now we've had a question from Peter Cameron. Now he goes right back to Gibbs' early life, and he asks, in what part did his Catholicism play? Because we know that he went off to Rome initially with the idea of studying for the priesthood. Did Catholicism continue to play a part in his life, or did he actually abandon it after Rome?
Well, it's a good question. It wasn't always easy for Gibbs. I think when he was working on St Mary le Strand, his fellow Scot, Colin Campbell, who was also a leading architect of the time, tried to get Gibbs dislodged from his position by telling people about his religion. Gibbs was dismissed, but actually a lot of historians would say it's because of the Catholicism. I would say it was for other unrelated reasons. But he managed basically to work with keeping his religion on the quiet. I think he externally conformed as an Anglican, but it was his faith was lifelong. When he died, he left provision in his will, which was left for the saying of requiem masses. So he was a lifelong Catholic, but I think he practiced his faith quietly. He was I think more interested in earning a living as an architect.
Okay, well, thank you so much, William. It's time to wrap up. It's been a fascinating, brief tour through the life and training and career of the man whom we know in the Barts community as the architect of the heritage buildings that we're all looking to conserve and protect for years to come. But thank you so much for that. To close, could I once again, of course, remind you, if you do wish to make a donation, simply make use of the donate button on the Barts Heritage website. We're offering these webinars free of charge to viewers through these difficult times. This, in fact, is the last webinar of the year. We're not going to do one next month, December, because we're all going to be quite busy enough in other respects. And then the program will restart in January. And of course, you'll get due notification of the way in which we plan that schedule in the weeks to come. So thank you to all those who have donated so far. Your donations are extremely grateful. I mentioned the patronage of His Royal Highness earlier in the program. And in fact, that was accompanied by a significant degree of publicity. And a welcome injection of donations to our funds that are all going to help conserve and protect the North Wing that William has been telling us about in detail over the last hour or so. William, perhaps a final word from you before we close.
Gosh, well, thank you so much for having me here to talk about your hospital, and I hope that it was informative, and that your viewers will have left knowing something more about the construction of the hospital and the life and background of its architect, Gibbs.
Indeed we have, indeed we have. So thank you to everybody. Thanks also to our friend and colleague Will Palin, who's been masterminding the technology behind the scenes and doing a sterling job to help bring this program to you. So until we meet again, a very good evening to you all.